Okay, so dear guests and dear experts, welcome to our second of three events within our series Belarus and Nervous System. Today's discussion is a very timely discussion, of course, as you all know, and focuses on the foreign policy dimension of the presidential elections and the wave of protests and solidarity, which seem to become ever bigger and stronger these days. My name is Mona Richter. I'm the co-head of the program Perspective East at Polis 180. Polis 180 is a grassroots think tank for European and foreign policy, which aims at bringing the ideas of our young generation into the political discourse and to create a platform for interdisciplinary exchange. But well, now to today's experts, actually. I'm very glad to welcome and introduce you to Arkady Moshes. He's the program director of the EU's Eastern Neighborhood and Russia program at the Institute for International Affairs. Welcome, Arkady. Thank you for joining. The second expert that we have with us today is Yauheni Preiherman, Director and co-founder of the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations. And lastly, but definitely not least, last but not least, Jakob Wöllenstein, Director of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung's Foundation's Office. And today's co-organizer as well, who actually also just released a really great song about the current Belarus. So I would just recommend to check out the Kas Belarus Facebook channel. And I'm also really happy to introduce you to today's host, Olga Dryndova. She's editor at Belarus Analysen and active member of Polis 180 as well, who will guide you through the discussion today. Before I will hand over the digital floor to Olga, I would also like to remind you to make use of your video and speaking rights as responsible as possible. As we want to create this discussion quite interactively, you can, of course, always turn off and on your microphone and video at any time. However, we would kindly like to ask you to wait to make use of your microphone, usage possibilities, options in a way, until we have reached the open discussion round later within our discussion. You can, if you want to ask a question, you can say your name later or raise your analog or digital hand or just write your name or question into the chat so we can, just collect them and ask them to our speakers within the discussion round later on. But now enough from my side. Thanks to everyone, to our guests and experts for joining us tonight. And now to you, Olga.
Thank you, Mona. Do you hear me? Everything okay? Okay, good. Dear speakers, dear guests, I'm happy to moderate our already second discussion, Belarus, in cooperation with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and the Centrum Liberale Moderne here in Berlin. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about the politicization of the Belarusian society and the new faces that we see now in the Belarusian politics. And today we want to concentrate on the foreign policy dimension of the current electoral campaign. So I think you already all know that Belarus gained international attention during this spring already, right? So as it surprised the international public with its official response to the pandemic. And it seems actually now that, well, this information policy during the pandemic was a kind of an important trigger that contributed to the protest moods that we can now observe in the Belarusian society. And now after the non-registration of three most popular candidates or figures as candidates, we are dealing with a kind of another international wave of attention to Belarus. And we see that headliners in Europe and the US name a former housewife, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, one of the most challenging competitors to the incumbent president in the Belarusian history. And we actually see that indeed about 2 to 5% of local population do come to the meetings with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and to other women that support her, which is actually quite unprecedented for the Belarusian politics. I mean, when we're talking about Belarusian regions, they never used to be that political before, politically active. So, and we also know that according to human rights organizations, about 60,000 people came to a rally in Minsk last week, which is actually already more. Well, this number is already higher than that of the protesting people after the elections in the year of 2010. Just for his information. So the Belarusian authorities have so far reacted with repressions, with, well, against potential candidates, against bloggers, journalists, against peaceful people who demonstrated on the streets. And they also speak about the possible hard scenario with the use of weapons against those who would like to protest on the day or after the elections. And the president, we see that the president is keeps on visiting the military structures in Belarus. So it is now clear that the Belarus relations, both with its eastern neighbor, that is the Russian Federation, as well as with the European Union, will depend a lot on what happens on the 9th of August, and maybe also directly after, so on the reaction of the public, but also by the of the authorities of Belarus. So, dear speakers, we're curious now to hear what is your opinion, what is happening in Belarus and what could happen. And I think I would like to start with Yauheni. Yauheni, since you kind of represent the Belarusian side today, I would like to start the discussion with you. So we see that neither a European or pro-Russian orientation seems to play a more or less important role in this increased politicization of Belarusian society. Well, at least we don't see any candidates or potential candidates, because we know that they were not registered, showing a clear geopolitical agenda. And well, I mean, pro-Russian or pro-European, it doesn't seem to play a very important role in this campaign, although there used to be some speculations about the connections of Mr. Babarika to the Kremlin, but we still don't have any facts about that. So what does it actually tell us about the Belarusian society? Is the foreign dimension not that important for people? I mean, do they just need changes independently on the foreign policy agenda of the possible successor? And maybe you could also give us some recent data on the geopolitical preferences of the Belarusians. That would be the first questions, and it would be great if you could manage that in 5 minutes. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Olga. Big hello to everyone. It's a real pleasure. Thanks for having me here. Well, let's go directly into the question, since I'm really limited in time. As we all see right now, it's a plebiscite type of election. In other words, this campaign has very quickly turned into a situation where people are basically asking one single question. Are you in favor of the incumbents, or are you against the incumbents? And that, of course, has a very clear implication for the things which are discussed during this campaign, for the agenda. And the agenda is completely non-substantive. So it is not only the foreign policy issues which are absent from the agenda, but all other issues as well. If you look at what the candidates say, if you look at what the female trio say, and what the rallies are about, they're all about, why Lukashenko should go, and they talk about his unfair politics, his inefficient politics, and stuff like that. But of course, the overall message is that once they win, they want to call another election, and then that next election should be on the substance. So basically, that's it. That's the answer to the question. But I think it's still interesting to pose an alternative question. Would it be any different in terms of the substance if the election was different? I mean, if it was not just a plebiscite type election. And I think it's both a yes and no. It is yes because it's very natural for a country which you can qualify as an in-between state in other words, a small state that sits between Russia and the West, or Russia and the EU, to focus a lot on foreign policy issues. And of course, you find a lot of political actors who basically run on those foreign policy issues. Sometimes those are one-issue political actors, political parties. So you would definitely find some discussions about that. But it's also a no question, a no answer, because I would assume that under any circumstances, the front runners of the elections, I mean, those who would have real chances of getting elected, would still adhere to some kind of the same foreign policy agenda. Something you actually hear a little bit about from this year's candidates as well. So if you listen to what, for instance, Viktor Babariko, Valery Tsipkala, and even Svetlana Tikhanovskaya recently responded to the question, this very essential question these days, where does the Crimea belong? And to quote Tikhanovskaya, the response was, de facto, it is Russian, de jure, it is Ukrainian. Doesn't it remind you of anything? It is the exact quote Alexander Lukashenko came up with in 2014 when he was first asked this question by the Ukrainian, Russian, Italian journalist Slavik Schuster. So this formula stays. What does it mean for the foreign policy discourse of this country and for the elite narrative that we have? It probably means that over these years, some kind of foreign policy consensus has been formed, which reflects not just wishful thinking, but the realities on the ground. It reflects what a country which sits in between Russia and the EU and faces such a crisis on its doorsteps, which is the Ukrainian crisis, has to think about. And that's why I think, again, that the front runners, even in a proper election, would be adherent to this very narrative. And now, very lastly, on public opinion, and this is related to what I've just said about the expert and political consensus. If you ask me what the latest data suggest about the foreign policy preferences of the Belarusians, and I would say, that might sound a little bit strange, that the very latest opinion poll, which I think is worth consideration, which really tells us something about the Belarusian public and its attitudes, prevalent attitudes to foreign policy, was conducted back in 2013, that is 7 years ago. Because what you normally get in public opinion polls, which are conducted more regularly, even though we do have a problem with public opinion polls, but even those which get conducted normally ask Belarusians this dichotomous question: are you in favor of a closer relationship with the Russians or in favor of a closer relationship with the EU? And I would argue that doesn't tell you anything about the Belarusian population, about what society thinks in terms of foreign policy. Because if you asked me whether I prefer a Russian Lada car or the German BMW car, whatever I answer would not have any practical implications for a very simple reasons. I don't have a driving license. So my answer would mean nothing for the market. And that's the same with asking Belarusians whether they are in favor of a closer relationship with the Russians or with the EU. And back in 2013, the survey, which I think really makes sense and tells us something about the Belarusian public, asked 4 questions or gave 4 options from which people could choose answering to the question. So the first one is a closer relationship with the EU. And then 17.1% of the people said that, of those surveyed said that they were in favor of that. The second option was Russia, closer relationship, even deeper relationship with Russia. 23.3% said they wanted that. And now the 2 really important ones. 20% said that they wanted a close relationship simultaneously with Russia and the EU, 20%. And then the most popular answer, 30.9%, was those who said they preferred to cooperate with everyone but stay outside any serious engagements, either with the Russians or with the EU. So 30.9%. So I hope now you see what I meant. This is what you get when people are asked about options which seem feasible, not just theoretically, but in the practical reality, given the realities on the ground. And in my opinion, it does correspond with the expert discourse and consensus, and even political consensus I mentioned a few minutes ago, where you basically leave the difficult questions and you understand that major task for this country, given the difficult, tumultuous political circumstances around it, is to survive and to muddle through, as we like to say that. And I think I'll stop at this.
Thank you, Yauheni, for your opinion. So maybe we should start asking different questions to get different answers right about the preferences of Belarusians. A very interesting point, as long as you've already mentioned the Crimea problematic, I'll go further to Arkady. Arkady, well, last year you wrote in one of your papers, I will cite, the end of Lukashenko's personalist rule is likely to put a succession problem and possibly even a question about the country's political independence on the agenda. Well, so far we don't know if the current protest moods will actually put an end to the rule of the incumbent president. At least the state seems to have, you know, enough repression resources to combat these possible protests, public protests. But the question of Belarus independence, indeed, independence from Russia, indeed has been widely discussed for over a year already, since Russia offered a kind of closer integration within the Union of Russia and Belarus in exchange for usual economic preferences. I would have two short questions for you, also for 5 minutes. So the first one, could you please unpack this integration problematic a bit for our public, and maybe what has changed so far since the beginning of the electoral campaign? And the second question, how do Russian officials actually perceive the electoral campaign in Belarus, and maybe also in how far this campaign is actually present in the Russian public space? Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Olga, and thank you for the invitation. I'm glad I could finally join you and the technical problems were resolved. I hope everybody can see and hear me. Your questions are anything but small and short, but I'll try my best. Indeed, I wrote that the end of personalistic rule of Lukashenko will probably inevitably raise the succession problem, simply because that happens with all regimes of that type, who have enormous difficulty of passing the power and passing the structures. And in Belarus, it might be even only more difficult because over the last quarter of a century, a lot of people simply unlearned how to take the decisions. And when after Lukashenko, and there will be after Lukashenko at some point, they'll have to deal with neighboring powers, which have experience, which have resources. It will be very difficult not to walk into certain traps that might be there around. Integration is not one of them, because integration, that's a rhetorical game that has been played by both for probably since the moment when, again, Mr. Lukashenko came to power a quarter of a century ago. There was a lot of let's pretend posture in the behavior of both countries. And as we know, it was not leading anywhere. In the bilateral state, certain things were done. In the Eurasian Union, certain things were done. But even in the Eurasian Union, which is much more serious and much less declaratory and much more legally binding than the Union state, basically it's not an economic union. I mean, out of 4 freedoms, the participants have 1.5. One is the freedom of movement of labor, and half is a freedom of movement of goods. Lots of things were declared and not done, and even more was the case as concerns the Belarusian bilateral integration. Recently, I mean in the last couple of years, Russia started to change the rules of the game. The rules of the game, or the end of the game, the goal of the game was to keep Belarus in the same position, meaning to guarantee the geopolitical loyalty of Belarus to Russia at the level where it used to be, where it has been throughout all these years, and pay less for that. It's not that Russia cannot afford the level of subsidies that it has been given Belarus over the last 20 years. It just doesn't want to do it. It believes that it has enough structural influence on Belarus and over Belarus so that these massive investments will not be needed any longer. Has this campaign changed something? Probably at the concluding stage of the debate we can talk, But I would say before the Russian mercenaries, the soldiers of the private military company were arrested in Belarus several days ago, before that happened, I wasn't willing to see any change. Analytically, I couldn't see the grounds for that. Basically, to keep the freedom of maneuver of Belarus at minimum and pay less for that. That was the name of the game. Now we might need to rethink certain things, because clearly that means that what's going on shows us that Minsk is failing the loyalty test, because certain things should not be done, and even when they are done, they should not be publicized that much. But I'm not yet, at this moment, I'm going to go through all that. What I want to say now is to answer your second question about the Russian view of the campaign and of this election as such. Again, up until several days ago, the Russian media were rather calm, I would say. They were reporting the story, reporting both sides of the story, but they were not particularly making a point. Same was true for Russian politicians. Now you have Vladimir Zhirinovsky, very critical about Lukashenko, and several members of the Russian parliament, especially the upper chamber, very critical of Lukashenko, using the words which go well beyond what is normally accepted in the diplomatic parlance between the countries. But basically, this is a very new and emotional thing. Kremlin stayed very calm and very balanced throughout the campaign. It didn't react even to the raiding of the Gazprom Bank. And there is a reason for that, and the reason is fundamental. Kremlin is not necessarily enthusiastic and happy about one more extension of the presidential term of Alexander Lukashenko. But on the other hand, this is the partner it can easily live without for three reasons. Again, for one reason, which can be then dissected into three components. And that reason is that for as long as Lukashenko is in power in Belarus, Belarus will be denied to the West. Belarus will not go the Ukrainian way. And the three components are the following. First, the structural influence of Russia over Belarus grows. It just grows. Economic dependence of Belarus on Russia is growing. The money keeps coming from Russia. The investment keeps coming from Russia. The debts keep coming from Russia. The markets are open in Russia. The labor travels to Russia. And you have even symbolic things like 12 years ago, Beltransgaz was not owned by Russians. After the elections of 2010, it got to be owned by the Russians. And I mean, I could go on with other examples. So structural economic influence grows, and structural soft power influence at least does not weaken. Second, Lukashenko is a member of the same international of autocrats as Putin. So he is a member of the club. He is afraid of color revolutions. He is not going, that's the second, and the third, he is not going to do any reforms which are needed even to make it possible for Belarus to integrate with the West, with Europe, even potentially, even hypothetically, even in the long-term perspective. If Russia could replace Lukashenko with somebody more to its liking, it probably could, but it has not been able to do so. And again, in that case, it would face the risk because it can put somebody else whom it will like more, but that somebody else might not be able to manage the situation. Or if things just go out of balance, that person will not be able to keep the situation under control. So given all these considerations, Lukashenko is not an ideal choice of Russia, but it is the safest bet. And therefore, up until recently, I think Russia was indirectly still supporting of Lukashenko. If it didn't want to support him, it could have behaved completely differently.
Thank you very much, Arkady. Just a short comment to our guests, just in case you don't feel like asking any questions live after the discussion, you can already start using our chat function for questions if you don't want to make it live. Okay, we'll then continue with the European dimension of our foreign policy discussion. Jakob, we would like to ask you a couple of questions about the EU-Belarus relations. Well, we all know that relations between the European Union and Belarus used to actually to depend on the outcome of elections for quite a long time. So the European Union would demand free and fair elections, the Belarusian side would fail, so to say, to meet these criteria, and then the EU would impose sanctions and so on. And these, so to say, vicious circles seem to come to an end after Belarus took more or less neutral position in the Ukraine crisis. So we saw that both presidential and parliamentary elections in Belarus did not lead to further deterioration of bilateral relations, although we of course also saw that the elections were not free and fair. And we could also talk about some kind of debates on, you know, security first, vice versa, democracy first in the EU's foreign policy. Do you think that the current wave of repressions that we see now in Belarus could put this positive dimension in relations between EU and Belarus under question once again? What has actually been already the reaction of the European Union so far to the electoral campaign in Belarus? And maybe you could also tell us about the most important, the biggest challenges that in foreign policy that the EU has now in terms or towards Belarus. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Olga, for the questions, and welcome also from my side. It's good to be here and see so many familiar faces. Somehow I was under the impression that it would be a Berlin audience tonight, so it's especially nice to see that we make use of the digital capacities and have people joining from very different places all over Europe. So thank you for the questions. I think we could have an evening of conversation only about these questions. But maybe starting with the notion that you said that there has been this notion of security versus democracy. And I would say this is not all of it. This would be too short to narrow the last 5 years down to this, that we as a European Union would have been selling out on principles completely over geopolitical considerations. Because I think the European Union's position of what we want to see in Belarus is a sovereign, stable, and free, prospectively democratic Belarus, but sovereign, stable, and peaceful. And taking the Ukrainian experience into consideration, I think the notion that we want Belarus to exist as a country and to remain there as a sovereign player was important. And so maybe the preference has been on maintaining this, yes, maybe true, but also looking at the promise that, for example, Minister McKay has been making, for example, last year in Berlin, saying that Belarus is on track to democracy, but with smaller steps than people might want this to be. Of course, this narrative can be questioned, whether you can evolve into democracy without having a break at some point. But then if you look at the last 5 years, there has been progress also on these issues. There was the election in 2016 that for the first time saw MPs in the parliament from opposition or independent parties. There was some progress, limited, but some progress in the freedom for civil society. The press freedom index, Belarus went up by 4 or 5 places, but still there was some little progress. There was the human rights dialogue with the European Union. And also this is something which people would not say openly, but would say in close conversations, that for a long time, Lukashenko could credibly claim to have at least some support in the population over his promise to maintain sovereignty, keep out war, and have some decent living and some social standards. So this was, I think, part of the game, seeing that there was some actual progress. The European Union was not completely selling this out. And the reactions, I mean, last year, after the last parliamentary elections, was also some disappointment, because we said we need to see the next steps, at least no backsliding on these issues. And then you saw that in the last parliamentary elections, there were no free parliamentarians readmitted to the parliament or even elected. So there was some open criticism about this issue. And the question whether the European Union has been setting geopolitics as a priority over democracy, I would also contradict this to a certain point. You see that the European Union has been not seeing things through this geopolitical lens. Now the European Commission wants to be a geopolitical commission, meaning that they were not geopolitical in the past. People in the European Union were surprised over what happened in Ukraine, and even arguing years after this that they did not see, still do not see any geopolitical element whatsoever to the Eastern Partnership. And I think a strong argument, if the Eastern Partnership was supposed to be an instrument of geopolitically pulling countries to the West, Georgia would have been a member of the European Union for a longer time to make sure that we take this geopolitically into our own realm. And this has not happened because its principles and geopolitics is something that the European Union is still trying to learn. And yes, the West has been appreciating and still appreciates the role Belarus has assumed as a donor of regional stability and a negotiator for the Ukraine crisis. So all this was also on the side of having. It was not only giving this away. And the message, as I said, was no backsliding, hoping for some small advantages. You referred, Mona, to my new song. You know that the chorus is not anti-Lukashenko but pro-Belarus, and this is also what European politicians have been saying. Also recently, before these the last events, I had a high-ranking official from the European Union, from the European Parliament, also say in the close conversations, if Lukashenko opens elections and he gets re-elected, we are happy to work with him. It's about the principle of having free elections, not against this person, but we want to see progress on that issue. So the reactions from the European Union and representatives so far. There has been strong messaging, again, in favor of sovereignty. As early as April, from the High Representative Borrell, there was a statement that the European Union supports the sovereignty and independence of Belarus. There was a joint statement from their missions in Minsk in June, also saying we are friends of the country, we want sovereignty and independence, but at this point, when the things were already getting quite ugly in the streets, always referring to that we as the European Union collectively condemn violence and call on the release of political prisoners. And this was basically the baseline, these messages. Also in the Twitter tweets of von der Leyen, there was a conversation in the European Parliament on 9th of July, also saying human rights issues must be taken into consideration. We call upon release of these people, but we strongly support independent Belarus. And also I think this is important, there has been a lot of direct messaging to the people of Belarus. There was this open letter from members of parliament on June 1st saying we are in support of you and we stand with Belarus. Although the question is, what does the European Union really have to offer? We've heard this from Arkady, that the actual leverage is quite limited, what the European Union can do instead of applying, or in case of applying pressure. But there has been also the call from MEPs on the 7th of July, so not very long ago, to really consider sanctions again, but those sanctions to be very much tailored to individuals who violate human rights and falsify elections. And the last question, already beyond the 5 minutes, what are the biggest challenges in foreign policy towards Belarus in the European Union? I think, of course, things are now related to the outcome and the course of the next weeks, to have as little violence as possible, no blood, of course. I think this is a very, very baseline demand, and the release of political prisoners. But I think also the question is how to strike the balance between maintaining credibility of the European Union as a player that stands for human rights and freedom and democracy, but not burning all the bridges that have been built to Belarus, instead of a scenario that gets dirty and something we don't even want to imagine at this point. So how do we make sure that beyond the election day, because we see now that more than half of the population, whatever, if you look into polling, that won't change, this is not going to go away regardless of the scenario we will see. So make sure we can reach out to these people also in the future, work together and not burn the bridges. And still there are some issues that are, regardless of the present situation, which is, for example, the lack of a basic document of the Astravets issue, the nuclear power plant being built in the vicinity of Vilnius on the Belarusian side. I think this is an issue which is not depending on the present elections, but this is something which is also not going to go away after election day. Let me finish here after 8 minutes instead of 5.
Okay, we'll see at the end. We have to, to take your minutes at the very end in the second round of questions. Now, I think it's all important information. We started a bit later, so I think we'll finish also about maybe 20 minutes after 7:25, just for our guests to know our timing. We come back to the Belarusian perspective, and Jakob, you already mentioned that some kind of, not that very good scenarios, of course, also possible. And at the same time, the European Union doesn't want to burn the bridges, but let us imagine, I mean, that these kind of scenarios are actually possible right now, because it really gets serious in Belarus. So, Yauheni, let us now analyze the foreign policy logic of the Belarusian authorities. I mean, there have been some clear signs of a possible hard scenario. The president has been talking, you know, about the usage of the military against the people, and actually there are well, we don't know what will happen, what will happen on the 9th of August, but there have been some signs, you know, that the president is keeps meeting with the military structures. He also mentioned, you know, some bloody scenarios in Asian states in the past. So there are kind of hints coming from the authorities that it's not that that the people who would like to protest are, of course, not that welcomed. Of course, that could possibly lead to some EU sanctions and limit the space for negotiations with Russia, both on integration issues and also on economic aid. And at the same time, Arkady already mentioned this case, these Russian mercenaries, members of whatever private military company from Russia, were detained in Belarus last week, and we heard that the Belarusian side actually blamed Russia for destabilizing the situation in the country ahead of the election. So it doesn't really seem very logical for quite a lot of people. So could you please give us your vision of what is actually happening in the Belarus-Russian relations for a couple of days already? And do you actually see any signs of the planned Russian intervention in the Belarusian elections, or are we having just speculations here, some war, media wars and so on?
Well, let me perhaps very quickly begin with a different thing. So you mentioned the logic of Belarusian foreign policy and Belarusian regime. I think it's pretty obvious that this is an authoritarian regime, and it has never hidden this definition. And at some point, some representatives of the government even tried to boast about this. You do not have any other expectation from an authoritarian regime but to see it resort to force whenever it feels threatened. And this is important for our discussion about foreign policy, because when an authoritarian leader feels safe domestically, he normally tends to behave in a way that is more or less compatible with what you can define as a national interest. This is not just the case of Belarus. And basically, if you look at the academic literature, you find a lot of cases where not only authoritarian regimes, but any regime, any government, when it is coherent enough and there is enough consistency and coherence between the government and other forces in society, then what you get as a foreign policy is normally a consensus-based, national interest-based foreign policy. And again, I think this is extremely important, because for the last 5-6 years, the foreign policy that Belarus conducted was, in my view, fully in line with what you can define as a national interest, given the circumstances on the ground. And of course, once this is changing, the internal dynamic is changing, the authoritarian leader is resorting to anything he can do to make sure that he stays in power. And this is where this crisis, a conflict between the national interest and what academic literature describes as omni-interest, omni-balancing emerges. Now to Belarus-Russia relations. I generally agree with most things that Arkady said, but I do disagree on one background development. So let me explain it. Basically, Arkady said that in recent years, Moscow was trying to pay less because it was sure that Belarus was dependent on it anyway and didn't have any room for maneuver anyway. I think this is wrong. I think the fundamental difference and the critical disjuncture that happened after 2014 was about a different development. It basically brought to an end the informal grand bargain that had existed between Belarus and Russia since the mid-90s. The bargain was very simple, and this is what Arkady spoke about. The bargain was about Belarus exchanging its geopolitical loyalty for all sorts of economic benefits that Russia provided, including access to discounted oil and gas, to the Russian market, which was always or often politically motivated, and also to beneficial loans and stuff like that. So what happened in and after 2014 is described in the international relations theory as an intra-alliance dilemma. In other words, after the crisis in Ukraine broke out, Belarus could no longer offer its full geopolitical loyalty to the Russians, because for the first time ever, Belarus' own relationship with the EU and the West in general got to be better than the Russian relationship with the West. This is critical. This is very important. For the first time, it happened. This means that if Belarus provides its full loyalty to Russia in a situation where Russia has entered this escalating tension, military political tension with the West, Belarus can easily get entangled in a conflict or a situation not of its own choosing. And given the geographic position of Belarus, where it sits geographically between Russia and NATO, this is a highly dangerous situation. So Belarus could no longer offer that. Russia, on this other side, saw any behavior by Belarus as a way of basically leaving it as so whatever Belarus did besides bandwagoning with Russia was seen in Moscow as an unwanted development. So what really happened after 2014 was that no matter what Russia was ready to offer to Belarus, Belarus was not ready to offer full geopolitical loyalty, and Russia would not be satisfied with anything else. This explains why the Russians came up with this idea that they wanted to deepen bilateral integration. And of course, it didn't work out last year. And this is now critical for understanding what the Russians want out of this election. And here I fully agree with Arkady. They need Lukashenko to be reelected, but they need him to be on his knees. In other words, with a blown society and with broken relations with the West. At that point, it will be much easier for them to get back to the negotiations about deepening bilateral integration and to force Lukashenko into accepting at least some of Russia's demands. Because last year, as you remember, despite all the talk about conspiracies and Lukashenko was selling sovereignty, he didn't do that. Whether we like him or not, he didn't do that. And he basically told the Russians that they could, turn around and go away if they wanted him to accept something he was not ready to accept. This is critical. So this is what they want to have out of this election. And very final remark on the very latest developments with the Wagner Group. I also think that this might be a game changer. I don't know what really happened, and no one knows. So I suggest we don't go into those conspiracy theories because we just don't have the data. But the critical question about what happened is this: why would Lukashenko, even if what he claims to be the case was true, why would he so quickly and without any reservations go to the public and say that the Russians were behind that? This is just, beyond any code of conduct on the post-Soviet space. The leaders of the post-Soviet space are not supposed to behave like that. This is just the worst you can do. So why would he do this? You can accuse Lukashenko of anything, but in the end, he's not an idiot. And if you trace his political background, he stayed in power for 26 years because he was still rational in many things he did. We don't like, the basis of that rationality, but still he managed to do rational things. Why would he do this? The only sort of hypothetical suggestion I can offer is that probably he expects what we talked about a second ago, that once he's over this election, but really weakened and on his knees, the Russians are going to do something horrible to him. And that's why he thought it was acceptable enough to raise political stakes to these heights right now, and to make sure that at least he could minimize some other side effects of what's going on. And I think I'll stop at this.
Thank you, Yauheni. It's also a good point to hear maybe the Russian side, so to say, that is being represented today by Arkady. If we take into consideration what is now happening in Russian-Belarus relations, and also, with questionable developments with these military groups, and if we think about what could happen at the election day. So in 1 week, we already have the official election results. So maybe you could tell us about the possible scenarios that you already have in your head, so to say. So the scenarios of the election outcome, the scenarios of the public reaction to it, and the authorities' response that are more or less probable in this case, and how could Russia react to these different scenarios if you actually see different scenarios at all? Maybe we only see one scenario is possible, and what will it mean for the future of Belarus-Russia relations?
With due respect, Olga, I have to say that I do not represent the Russian side. By no means. I've been living in the West for 20 years. I follow the Russian developments, I analyze the Russian developments, as well as I analyze developments in many other countries. I do not associate my point of view with either official Russian point of view or even the alternative points of view that exist in Russia. It's just I'm in a different profession. But answering the question, I don't see many scenarios. There probably are there when we're talking about what's going to happen next week, next Monday, a week from now. But I have one working assumption. And that working assumption is that the regime will do whatever it will need to do to have itself staying in power. Lukashenko will do everything he will need to do to get himself reappointed to the position. I'm refraining from using the word re-elected. He probably will receive something like, or the Central Electoral Commission will announce that he will have received something like between 65 and maybe 75% of the vote. There will be protests probably. The size of these protests is difficult to predict. The protests will not go for long, because as we saw in 2010, the lesson had been learned. In 2006, the protests were allowed to continue for a while. In 2010, it didn't take them long. The repressions will be maybe calibrated, but I mean, they will be applied to the extent necessary, because his game is based on one understanding, that the winners are not to be judged. If he stays in power, he'll find the way to explain to the West why he did what he had to do, and he will find the possibility to renegotiate with Russia a new modus operandi. Which is sad, but this is what it is. I don't think that the protests will be sustained, because people usually sustain the protests when they have the ideological understanding of how the better future looks like and why they should do it. If it's just about protests and if it's scattered, it's much more. And when they know whom they deal with, and they deal with a very well consolidated and brutal regime. If shrapnel will need to be used, it will be used. And that's what everybody knows. So what kind of an impact it will have? Yeah, but then as we hear from many commentators, and they're right. So what matters is not whether or not there will be a new inauguration of Alexander Lukashenko. Most likely there will be the new inauguration of Alexander Lukashenko. What matters is that his legacy and his legitimacy will be finally ruined, and it will be weakening and weakening and weakening, because he has nothing new to offer. He cannot offer 500 euros of a monthly salary. He cannot offer integration with Russia. He cannot offer a total reset, another reset of relations with the West, and so on and so forth. So he's short of ideas. His legitimacy will be running out. And that means that when we are thinking about already midterm perspective, the whole situation is in danger, and it will be in danger from the Russian point of view. So of course you can negotiate with Lukashenko, you can talk about this 31st roadmap of integration, or maybe a common fiscal code, or new loans in exchange for property on the Belarusian territory, and so on and so forth. But most likely Kremlin, seeing actually even the current wave of protests and the current wave of people's popular dissatisfaction with the life in the country and with the performance of the regime, Kremlin will finally get somewhat scared and definitely concerned that actually, regardless of Lukashenko, some years down the road, Belarus may choose the Ukrainian way. Through Maidan, through much more serious wave of protests, not now. And that might push Kremlin in the direction of applying more pressure on Belarus, in the direction of exactly increasing the structural influence that it already has. This is what is dangerous. This is what I think, why I wrote what I wrote a year ago, that this is the timing, the critical moment when the very fact of sovereignty and independence of Belarus might be in question. But we will not necessarily see it on the 10th or 11th of August. It's something that will need to be followed. It might start happening already for us when Lukashenko is in power. But this is where the scenarios and the possibilities come into play, but not when it concerns the immediate aftermath of the elections.
Thank you, Arkady. Just a short comment on what I've said. Of course, I meant your analytical position as well as the position of Yauheni representing, so to say, the Belarusian side, and Jakob representing EU Germany. Now we're coming. We actually also would like to talk about the German dimension or German vision of the current situation in Belarus, since we organize this event from Germany, so to say, and with German institutions. So we know that bilateral relations between Germany and Belarus have gained some dynamic recently. For example, a couple of years ago, the federal president Steinmeier met with Lukashenko in Belarus, and there was a common Belarusian-German historical commission that is functioning now and came as a result of this visit. Then this year, a German-Belarusian intergovernmental commission has begun its work, and we also know that the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, together with the Minsk Dialogue, also organized a couple of times a big international conference with the participation of leading think tanks in the area of security. And we know that the Belarusian president took part in this conference. So I can guess that Germany does not really want to lose this positive dynamic. So Jakob, now the question, almost same question is to you. So what scenarios do you see for the 9th of August and afterwards? Maybe you're a bit more optimistic than Arkady. What will it actually mean for the EU-Belarus and Germany-Belarus relations, and maybe also specifically in the light of the German EU Council Presidency, which just started a month ago? Thank you.
I need to be very careful what I say now, because I know that among the audience we have representatives of the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs who know these things even a lot better than I do, and people that have been working in German-Belarus relations for maybe even longer than I am alive. Just to add one notion to the argument I made initially, because we've been speaking about the Wagner Group, that the European Union has not been taking a merely geopolitical approach. I think this is also confirmed in the reactions we have seen to the Wagner incident, where clearly, as we've heard from Arkady, this card has been played as Belarus now positioning itself as defending itself against Russia and hoping for understanding from the West for a tougher stance that is being taken against protesters. And so far, the reactions that I've seen and read did not really buy this story and said, well, we don't think this is genuine. Western voice is not saying this is genuine. So from a German point of view, also another comment, the question whether protests have to be consolidated and have a consolidated vision for the future in order to work and to be sustained. I mean, this is what Arkady said, and picking up on Yauheni, saying that we don't see a lot of contents being discussed at the moment in Belarus. But I mean, from the German experience, what we've seen in the revolution of 1989, there was not a consolidated vision of the future. And in fact, people that took to the streets had very different understandings. And it was firstly the experts and intelligentsia, so to say. They actually wanted to have roots within a separate Eastern German state, and all this dynamic was then soon just left aside by history, that then led to the unification of Germany. But it did not take one unifying idea to have people being afraid of, to be discontent. And even the state at this point in time threatening very much the use of force. In Leipzig, at these big demonstrations, paratrooper units were standing by just the next street to Augustusplatz under arms, ready to strike and waiting for an order. So people just we're not afraid to go against something with different ideas of the future. So I would not exclude the scenario of a peaceful transition, especially in the circumstances when this is not being perceived as a geopolitical choice of the country going one way or the other. And I think this is something which the European Union has to keep in mind in their messaging and their approach, but also what we've heard about the Russian positioning, that if this is not a story about Belarus going west or east, but staying where it is and choosing for a different future in its country. I saw Tony van der Tocht asking this question about the Armenia scenario, which I think would be closest to this, not breaking geopolitically, but taking a different direction internally. I would not exclude this, seeing that there have been a lot of similar experiences in different countries at different times. But of course, this is not something which is analytically the clearest option, but seeing Lukashenko the way he is and going around military barracks and preparing the units to strike down, of course, this is a scenario which we see unfolding at the moment. So about German-Belarus relations, I think it is important to keep in mind that the relations between these two countries are not only limited to the highest ranking official contacts. You've mentioned Steinmeier visiting, politicians coming. And of course, these initiatives will be put under some question marks, whether we can continue the same way we used to, or we have been conducting them. There's a strategic partnership group working out ideas as we speak in this year. And there will be obviously question marks if there is a major crackdown with violence on what projects we can pursue on the official level. But nevertheless, there is a huge network of contacts that do not necessarily completely depend on the best weather between foreign ministries and between the president's office and the chancellery. But there's city partnerships, there's all the Chernobyl initiatives that grew up 30 years ago that are still active. There's cultural exchange, there's youth exchange, there's contacts in education, a lot of economic initiatives that have been growing up, and even local initiatives. I've been working a lot with Saxony closely over the last 1.5 years, and on this level, Freistaat Sachsen and Belarus, there are concrete initiatives that all want to continue. Nobody wants this to be taken hostage to an overall situation which goes down. So, well, for the scenarios, I think there are 4 scenarios, depending on how much violence is being applied, especially if we have a bloody scenario. Blood in the streets will be a game changer. And then on the outcome, does it lead to Lukashenko remaining in power, or does it lead to some sort of transition? And depending on this, I think the European Union and Germany will have to adjust their policies. But again, there are, according to polls, more than half of the population in Belarus wants change and wants to have a different future, wants to have reforms, wants to have freedom of vote. And it will be key and essential to still maintain the opportunity to work with these people, but also work with people that represent the system, because I'm still very much convinced, standing for Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, that in dialogue, a system which I think has been proven to be good and democratic and produce the best results is going to be attractive in the long run. So also talking to people within the regime, and there are people that are also open for reforms and dialogue. This will be key. So in the German presidency of the European Union now, it will be mainly about, in the long run, preparing the summit of the Eastern Partnership, which is set to March 2021. So it's not in this time, not a present meeting, and looking at the Corona situation, we don't see this coming up in a different way. You know, there's these priorities in the Eastern Partnership that have been decided on, which is resilience, for inclusive societies, connectivity, sustainability, rule of law, and integrated economies. There is a lot of potential to cooperate with Belarus, but again, I think the question of sanctioning, of methods that work like sanctions could work, will be on the table if we see a scenario unfold that is dirty.
Thank you, Jakob. We are a bit running out of time, so just have one last short question to Yauheni, since Yauheni has not still talked about the possible scenarios, so just maybe for a couple of minutes, if you manage it, maybe up to 3 minutes, since already quite a lot of things have been mentioned already. And just to give our speakers interesting figures of one of the latest opinion polls that show that at least half of Belarusian population see a current danger for the Belarusian sovereignty. According to recent opinion polls, while only 25% are actually ready to endure certain decline in the living standards to save the state's independence. So people actually see there could be some danger, supposedly coming from the Russian Federation to the sovereignty of Belarus, but still only 1/4 of population are, so to say, ready to, to wait a certain amount of time till the economy of the state stabilizes. And maybe, I'm sure you already seen this poll, so could you shortly comment on the results? What do you think this show is about the Belarusian society, and also make some concluding remarks from your side? So what could happen in 1 week? What should we wait from the sociality side, so to say? Do we have to prepare ourselves to mass protests? What could be the reaction of the authorities? And of course, what could it mean for the foreign policy of Belarus, and if possible, also for its sovereignty, if you have this opinion that there could be some danger for the independence of Belarus, depending on the scenarios?
Well, these are big questions for 3 minutes, so let me say a couple of words. First of all, on that latest research, as the researchers who did it said in the media, it provides us with both good and bad news. The bad news is that the number of those who are willing to stand for sovereignty in the face of difficulties is not big enough. But the good news is that overall, the majority of the Belarusians see sovereignty as a value. But let me make another point which might sound a little bit sort of under appreciating public opinion polls, like I tried to say in response to the first question. I think the real problem in Belarus is not about public opinion, but it's about the elites. And we can hold lots of discussions about what the public think. But the fact of the matter is that we still don't have a proper national elite in this country. For the 26 years, it's been a very divided country, and elites have been the main reflection of that division. You have the governing elites, you have those in the opposition and civil society who are always opposed to the government. This is pretty much a standard situation for an authoritarian regime. But in the last 5-6 years, and I also think it was related to what happened in Ukraine and those processes that started in Belarus following the Ukraine crisis, we started to have at least some discussion among the elites, mainly on foreign policy. And by the way, as a result, you now see what I called in the beginning as this emerging foreign policy consensus. Unfortunately, the big tragedy of this electoral campaign is that all that effort of the last 5-6 years is going to be undermined. And this means that whatever happens and how much hope we hold for all those uncoordinated protests, this is going to nowhere. Because when you don't have at least some elite communication between the different groups of elite, I mean, not only the governing elite and not only within the opposition elite, I'm afraid that what is going to happen on August 9 is a highway to a tragedy. All what is happening because people are expressing their emotional attitude towards the authorities. People are fed up with the regime, and they have very good reasons for that. But when this is not led by any responsible political actor who is himself part of a broader political elite in the country, who is capable of understanding and identifying not only the interests of a small group of people, but of society at large and somehow coordinating those interests with the national interest. This is, as I said, a highway to a tragedy. I think only a miracle can save us from the worst case scenario. I don't want to sound, too dramatic and negative, but this is unfortunately the analysis which I have held since a few months ago, and Jakob knows that very well. In early April, I wrote an op-ed trying sort of to call on what should be an elite in this country to think about these possible circumstances. And I think in those days it was still possible to somehow, lower the degree of this confrontation and make sure that emotions do not overwhelm everything and leave at least some space for irrational thinking. But I think at this point it's too late. So as I said, we can only hope for the better. And after it happens on August 9, everyone who is really interested in having Belarus as a sovereign state will need to sit down and try to figure out what can be done in that new reality.
Thank you, Yauheni. Thank you also for trying. Jakob, do you have some direct comment on what Yauheni just said? Okay.
Yeah, maybe like a provoking question directly going back to this. Because I recently read that Lukashenko has been quoting or referring to the possibility of a conspiracy being forged behind his back within the elites. And of course, I don't want to be spinning any of these conspiracy theories, but do you see as a more than completely theoretical option that people from within the system, be it ministers, be it generals, be it somebody who's been maintaining the system, could come out in the following week and say, I'm going to support the opposition, or I'm going to support the call for free elections. And I'm not going to, for example, a general saying, I will not shoot at someone. It's not going to happen. And there's this bridge being built at the very last minute.
Yauheni, I thought it was the direct question to Yauheni, right?
Okay, the short answer is no. And even if something like this happens, I don't see a situation where this can have a spillover effect leading to a break among the elites. I mean, the governing elites. Again, I don't think we have a proper national elite, but a governing elite. And, that's the key problem about all this election, because what the opposition and people who, wanted to and still want to change the situation are hoping for is that somehow the people in the positions to make decisions will see this massive protest, and this will lead to the governing elite breaking. Unfortunately, as of today, I don't see this as very feasible.
But I mean, as you've rightly said, over the last years, be it only the last 5 years, also within economic elites and political elites, things have been built up that could not be lost. If all these relationships with the West or just opportunities to make business are being crushed over the ambitions of the leader to stay in power, whatever it takes, using force, and then coming to the scenario to just being able to turn back to the Kremlin, wouldn't they at some point use the egoistic motivation to maintain the opportunities for making business over the loyalty?
Again, not to occupy too much time. I simply don't think that enough time has passed for this to become a realistic scenario.
Okay, it's actually very good that we already now have a kind of discussion between our speakers before we actually came to the questions from our public. We still have about 10 minutes for the questions, and I see that we have about 3 questions. Just give me a sign if anybody wants to ask a live question, because I don't see any raised hands. So just start with a question that we already have in our chat here. And I'll start with a question of Arkady Schreibman. The question is to all panelists, so just decide whether you would like to answer it. What's your sense of the bar for sanctions in Brussels? What has to happen in Minsk to force even the reluctant EU to impose them? I mean, the sanctions question was already mentioned, but some of the speakers, but maybe you could talk specifically, more specifically about it right now. Who would like to start? Maybe Jakob is, yes.
Okay. So I think the question is, the issue of sanctions has been put forward by members of the European Parliament. I took part in a meeting with a member of the European Parliament who pointed all the picture of human rights violations and then said, sorry for quoting, we need to sanction the shit out of these people who are openly breaking human rights. So it is there in the argumentation. And on the other hand, there is a lot of reluctance from member states because, as you know, imposing sanctions is more than just the actual outcome of the effect of sanctions, but it's a category in international relations, as Artyom knows very well. So once you pass this threshold of having more sanctions, then it takes a lot of political capital to get a step backwards. And what the people are afraid now that look forward is what could happen, that we could be trapped in this game of the regime, for example, taking political prisoners as hostages in a way to say, if you drop sanctions, then we will release political prisoners, and this gets a predictable game. So I think there is some reluctance to pass this threshold. And the debate that I've been seeing so far is whether we couldn't come up with mechanisms that would work the same way sanctions do without officially using sanctions. So, for example, asset freezes have been on the table, or Schengen visa freeze. And whether, if the European Union could come to a point where Schengen visa in general and as a principle will never be issued to somebody who broke human rights on record or who falsified elections. Of course, we will have to prove this to the people who is the one who just took orders and who was the one who engineered this. If as a principle, those visas couldn't be handed out, you would circumvene sanctions. If you said this is after like 5 years or 10 years of passing, then it could be reconsidered. But this way, sanctions would not have to be applied. But it's there on the table for discussions.
Anything to add from Yauheni or Arkady?
Well, I'm personally not the right person to talk about the probability of sanctions. I hold very strong opinion why sanctions do more harm than good, but I think that's a different discussion.
Okay, I don't see any reaction from our. Sorry, so just go to the second question. Now we've been talking about.
I can say, but I mean, it's not going to be anything. Sorry?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we will always find the excuses not to introduce sanctions. But of course, introducing sanctions now would look ridiculous because the European Union did it several times before. And when the current phase of reset was discussed 5-6 years ago, many people were talking about cyclical relationship, and that sooner or later, if you drop the sanctions now, you might come to the point where you need to discuss whether to reintroduce them again. But when the sanctions were dropped 5 years ago, it became practically impossible to reintroduce them. The level of repressions should be, I don't know what, not the one that we are ready to prolong, and I don't think it's going to happen. So it's basically a non-issue. EU will decide that everything is fine and you can still reach through dialogue more than you can reach through sanctions. And EU will decide who is a political prisoner and who not is a political prisoner. Babarika, for instance, if he goes to jail and face criminal charges for economic crime, you know, some people will say he's a political prisoner and some people will say no. So it's, again, we will continue the debate, but I think the bottom line is that the reintroduction of sanctions is absolutely unlikely.
Thank you, Arkady. We've been discussing the EU and Russian dimension of the electoral campaign, so to say, in Belarus right now, but we actually not managed the US. So I have here a question about the US politics. Also to all the panelists, just give me a sign if you would like to answer it. So is it likely that the US will take a more lenient position than the EU towards the Belarusian regime after the elections?
I can begin if I may. Well, I think it is likely, even though there are quite a few unknowns in the future US position. First of all, as you know, US itself is quite in a turbulent state, and it is turbulent because of the COVID crisis, because of the demonstrations, Black Lives Matter and stuff like that, but also because of the upcoming election. So if Trump stays in power, then I think it will be a more lenient position. But if the Biden administration comes to the White House, then we can have quite different developments. Overall, the Biden presidency, the Biden candidacy, is now emphasizing that human rights is going to be one of its priorities, and they want to sort of get back to the previous Obama-era policies in terms of human rights. But I guess bridging it to a different question, which we'll discuss next, I remember when Nikol Pashinyan was in the opposition, and he was super anti-Russian and demanding that Armenia should leave the Eurasian Economic Union. And then when he came to power, became prime minister, the first thing he was asked, why don't you initiate this procedure to leave the Eurasian Economic Union? And he said, look, one thing what I said when I was in the opposition, forget it, I'm no longer in the opposition. So it might be the case that the Biden presidency is going to be a little bit like that, because we need to understand the world is changing. And it's not just about this artificial dilemma between human rights, democracy versus security and realpolitik. It's about the structural changes in the international system, which are about growing competition, strategic competition between the US and China. And as every nation is going to defend its own interests, at some point, the US will be interested in creating, in providing for its own geopolitical interests in the region of Eastern Europe. And it is inevitable that it will have to talk to any kind of regimes that are here. And so will the EU, even though, you know, the EU is a different kind of player, but the very fact that von der Leyen declared it's a geopolitical commission is telling, because I remember a few years ago, if I were to mention the word geopolitical inside the European Commission headquarters, it would amount to cursing there. So it's also quite a qualitative change. But yes, to sum it up, I think it might be more lenient, but there are still quite a few unknowns.
Thank you, Yevgeny, also for connecting the second question with the third one, but just come back to the question about the yes, maybe Jakob or Arkady would like to add anything. Nothing? Okay. Then the question, well, this question about the Armenian revolution, I think was already partly answered, but as long as Yevgeny already mentioned it, I just ask it once again. Maybe somebody from the speakers has another opinion. So the question is also to all the panelists: could you envisage an Armenian Belmet revolution, a scenario in Belarus with both Russia and the West staying out and not turning this into a geopolitical battle? The question is from Tony van der Tocht. I don't know, Tony, if you're already happy with the answer by Yevgeny, maybe we have some other opinion. Then was it you just show your hand? You wanted to add something because you already answered the question, right?
No, I didn't answer. I want to answer it in further detail, but perhaps someone else.
Okay, no,
will go first.
Sorry, just do it. Okay.
Should I start?
Sure.
Sorry, don't want to sort of occupy too much space and time. But I think it is a very important question for an obvious reason. And I think we need to answer it very honestly. Armenia and Belarus are very different cases. Arkady spoke about Belarus' structural dependence on Russia, which obviously exists primarily in the realm of economy, but it is still incomparable to the structural dependence on Russia that Armenia has, which is about security. Armenia has, out of its neighbors, at least a few who basically want to eradicate it, sort of eliminate it from the ground. And the Armenian-Turkish border is being protected by the Russian border guards. So there is no way that Armenia can simply, walk out of that relationship with Russia. And that's why, of course, the Russians could be much, calmer and feel safer about the change of power. They were certainly not happy about what happened in Armenia. And from what I know, Putin and Pashinyan still have this very special relationship, especially when they talk to one another. But in any way, Belarus is a different case. Dependency is there, but the level of fears on the Russian side is also incomparably higher. And that's why I have no doubt that when something starts happening in Belarus, which gets out of control of those who make decisions in Minsk, the Russians will not think for a second to interfere. I mean, I'm not saying they're going to stick their flag in Belarus and interfere in a physical way, but be sure they have lots of leverage and lots of opportunities to interfere and to make sure that things develop in the way which is to their interest.
Thank you. Jakob?
Yeah, I very much agree with what Yauheni said, that the situation, and here geopolitics do play a major role, is completely different. Although people like, for example, Andros Kubilius, member of the European Parliament, has this map in his office which shows Lithuania and the old borders going down to the Black Sea. It does not mean that Lithuania is going to occupy and invade Belarus. So it's a very different situation. And history does not repeat itself. I mean, this is also trivial, as well as all the other bon mots about how things can happen. I still would not exclude that if it comes to a situation in a transition in Belarus, that it would have to resemble in a lot of ways to what has happened in Armenia, that the country maintains a good relationship with Russia, that it does not break away from a Kremlin point of view, that it stays in some of these integration projects. I think this is even the only way that the country could realistically go at some point, to have reforms domestically and to maintain what we've identified over the last 18 minutes as being this national interest of having good relations with all sides, economically and on a people-to-people basis, that a candidate like what Babariko, at least according to what he said openly in his statements, modernization and economic reforms, but never breaking away from the good relationship with Russia, I think this would be the only way this could happen. And we've also heard that if Lukashenko stays in power the way, using all his methods that he has, the country will be different. And he will not live forever. He has said this himself. So there will be the day when the post-Lukashenko time will start, whether this year or next week, or whether in a few years. But that if there was supposed to be, again, domestic reforms and a peaceful transition, that would have to be similar to what happened in Armenia in some ways.
Thank you, Jakob. Arkady, would you like to add something? Otherwise, we would finish the discussion.
My problem was that at some moment the connection was lost, so I actually did not quite hear the question. But
I can just a second. The question was about the Armenian Velvet Revolution. You can also see it here in the chat on the right. So could you just wait a second, where is it? Could you envisage an Armenian Velvet Revolution, a scenario in Belarus with both Russia and the West staying out and not turning this into a geopolitical battle? Just because we're already out of time, maybe 2 minutes.
Yeah, I think, no, this question has been answered. No, I don't think. I think for Russia, Belarus has probably the same importance as Ukraine. That means that it cannot stay out. And even if there is a new leadership which will declare the willingness to have good relations with Russia, for Russia, good relations will not be enough. It's the geopolitical loyalty and it's a commanding lead, a commanding stakes in Belarus. That's what's Kremlin's interest. In Armenia, it's really different, because if you look at the borders of Armenia and compare them with borders of Belarus, you will immediately see the difference. Russia will not abstain from anything even remotely resembling a possibility of developments in Belarus going the pro-European way, let me put it that way.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our speakers for this great discussion today. Thank you for the organizers, for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and Leapmod and Polis 180. Please keep yourself, informing yourself about the situation in Belarus. It's really dramatic. It changes every day, literally every week. And we will just be hoping for good or miracle scenarios that might still be possible, as Yauheni mentioned. Next week, after the elections, it's not our last discussion in Belarus. We'll hold a third discussion round within this series, and I'll just give for 1 minute a mic to Mona, who will tell you about a bit more information about the next discussion that we are planning. Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you very much to all the speakers and to you, Olga, for hosting and moderating this event. Yes, I just do it like this. And yes, as Olga already said, we will have a third discussion within this event series, which will, of course, take place after the election, and actually not the week directly after the election, but actually 2 weeks from now on the 17th of August. So we will have enough time already to take a proper look at the results, and yeah, maybe already we will be able to see like first directions of where things are going after the elections or not. We will see. Everything is open in a way. So I would like to thank you, and yeah, stay tuned for more information on this. They will be yeah, published really soon, and thank you everyone also for staying with us longer than we envisioned. It was really nice to have this discussion today, and I wish you all a really nice evening. Thank you very much.